Why were the soldiers of the militia battalions so poorly trained before the Kokoda campaign? We look at the faults within the development of the training programs for the battalions.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 103 of the Principles of War podcast, Principles of Training. Today I'm going to pull out the principles of training from the current doctrine. As we look at each of the principles, we're going to highlight ways in which it was ignored in the development of the training programs for each of the militia battalions. There were 3 militia battalions in Papua at this time, so we've got the 39th, 49th and the 53rd Battalion. We will look at how they ignored these principles. We will look at the impact of ignoring those principles. We all have access to doctrine that was written 75 years after the Kokoda campaign, but that is no excuse. I'm going to use examples from the training of Australian troops in the Second World War before the Kokoda campaign to see what it looks like when troops are prepared correctly for combat. We'll be looking at the great work that Lieutenant General Ivan Doherty did as he prepared the 6th Division for the Battle of Bardia. For this analysis, I'm very grateful to Professor Craig Stockings in the book Zombie Myths of Australian Military History, the 10 Myths That Will Not Die, and his chapter, There is an Idea That the Australian is a Born Soldier. So let's get into it. There are 5 principles of training. They are: training is a command responsibility, unit training is critical, training must be realistic, it should encourage initiative, and evaluate and continuously improve. So let's get into the first one. Training is a command responsibility. The doctrine states, leaders and commanders at every level are responsible for ensuring that their subordinates undertake the training required to equip themselves to perform their roles and tasks and to develop the individual and collective skills required to do so. A key command responsibility is to set goals, design training programs, and provide training events for the training audience. Command responsibility extends to utilizing resources to meet training requirements and managing the risks associated with shortfalls in resource allocation. Senior commanders are expected to provide adequate resources to meet priority training requirements, particularly for mission-specific training. Commanders are required to use these resources in accordance with directed priorities. I think that the most important sentence in that is that it is a key command responsibility to set goals, design training programs, and provide training events for the training audience. One of the problems for the COs was what kind of training to conduct. We know that much of the very sparse amount of time available for training was taken up with anti-invasion training, running the troops through drills in case the Japanese landed at Port Moresby. The 39th and 53rd Battalions arrived less than 1 month after the Japanese attacks on Malaya and Pearl Harbor. What they saw was the frightening velocity of the Japanese advance. They didn't know how that velocity was being generated at this point in time. That meant that the training program had some uncertainties in it. That meant that the troops were conducting precautions against gas attack. How were they going to put their gas masks on? How were they going to continue fighting if the Japanese were using gas? Of the precious little time that Guinea Force had to train the troops, it was being spent on the wrong activities. At this point, however, it was highly likely that there was going to be a seaborne invasion at Port Moresby. So it's right and proper that they were conducting training for that. And it was only with hindsight that they would have realised that they didn't need gas training. That command responsibility for developing the training program really stops with the CO, the commanding officer of the battalion. I don't want to spend too much time looking at the role that Lieutenant Colonel Ward played in the development of the training program for the 53rd Battalion for a couple of reasons. Firstly, he would have been given directed tasks from Guinea Force, so he wouldn't have had too much left and right of arc when it came to designing a training program. Secondly, it wasn't him that was going to be executing that training program. It would have been done by the lieutenants and the sergeants within the battalion, as they looked to transfer their skills onto those of the new soldiers within the battalion. Lastly, we've already discussed that he didn't have a lot of time to execute on a training program. So let's have a look at the level of the lieutenant. The lieutenant and, potentially more importantly, the platoon sergeant would have been responsible for training The troops within that platoon, they're responsible for the individual soldier skills. They're responsible for the soldiers acting as a section, and then bringing those 3 sections together for them to be able to operate as a platoon. They're going to be fighting in the jungle. The platoon level is critical. Ideally, the lieutenants will have had enough time to get the platoon up to an acceptable level. Then the OCs, the commanders of the individual companies, would bring them together and wheel and deal those platoons to be able to create a company attack or a company in the defense. And then finally, after that, the CO is able to start moving companies around to create a battalion effect on the battlefield. Bearing in mind the lack of time and the lack of equipment, let's have a look at why the training fell down at the platoon level. To do that, we're going to look at one of the lieutenants within the battalion. That is Lieutenant Rolly Logan. His experience in the army is probably similar to many of the lieutenants within the battalion. He worked as a felt hatter. He joined the 30th Battalion on the 14th of March 1938. He was promoted to corporal on the 12th of March 1940. He attended the No. 1 Officer Training School at the Central Training Depot in Liverpool between the 7th of April and the 13th of June 1941. That's just 68 days for him to learn everything that he needs to learn to command a platoon. He's called up for duty and marches into the battalion on the 11th of November 1941. There are 2 mentions of Lieutenant Logan in the battalion war diary. The first is on the 20th of August. This is as the battalion is moving up the Kokoda track. Lieutenant Logan, acting as platoon commander, reported into Templeton's Crossing 0730 after being lost during darkness and taking the wrong track to Kargi. There were no troops accompanying this officer as he had become detached from his platoon during the night. Orders given to Lieutenant Logan to locate his platoon and await at Templeton's Crossing until their arrival, then move on with A Company. We can certainly commiserate with Lieutenant Logan. Becoming geographically embarrassed, losing the platoon during the middle of the night, both of these things would not have endeared him with the CO. However, let's think about this from the point of view of the young lieutenant. It's a very common meme about lieutenants who can't read maps, although I'm certain that he didn't have a map because there weren't any maps that were accurate of the Kokoda track at this point in time. So navigation at night without a map, that's going to be difficult. It's extremely difficult when you're trying to do that in the jungle and there's multiple tracks that crisscross the Kokoda track. He would have been travelling in the middle of the platoon, so the question then is, what was the march discipline like on the track? How could they have been separated like that? The other question is, what was the platoon sergeant doing? It's a little bit untidy for the platoon sergeant to lose his lieutenant. He's the one with all of the experience. He's the one who should have been making sure that the lieutenant kind of stuck along with the platoon. This, I think, is where we see the problem within the platoon writ large across the battalion. Lieutenant Logan has done a 68-day course to prepare him as a lieutenant. We don't really know what the syllabus at the No. 1 Officer Training School in Liverpool, which is where Lieutenant Logan did his officer's course. We're not sure what they were taught there, but we do know that 10 weeks is an extremely short amount of time to try and give an officer all of the skills that he's going to need to be able to wheel and deal a platoon. Compare and contrast this with the 22-week syllabus at Skyville, which Dave Sabin, who was one of the platoon commanders at the Battle of Long Tan, spoke glowingly of because it was full of extremely competent instructors. Not only that, the point of Skyville was to do one thing. It was to train officers to be able to command a platoon in the jungle. It was very focused, it was very concentrated, and many people were removed from the course because they weren't fit to command Australian troops in combat. If you haven't listened to Dave's interview on the podcast, definitely have a listen to it, because I think, and particularly there's also an interview with Lieutenant Colonel Harry Smith, who was the OC of Delta Company at the Battle of Long Tan. Listening to both of those officers and reading other officers' accounts of the Battle of Long Tan, it's very obvious that everything had been done at Skyville to prepare lieutenants to command a platoon in combat in the jungle. They then got 6 months in Delta Company, and Harry Smith did everything that he could to prepare them for success in combat. The skills, the tactics, the morale, everything was there to give them the best chance to be able to fight the Battle of Long Tan and survive. This is vastly different to the training and setup that Lieutenant Logan received. He had longer with his platoon in Port Moresby. However, most of that time was set conducting defensive tasks or working on the docks. I think this could have worked if he'd had a really strong platoon sergeant and corporals within the platoon. However, let's have a look at the training for the corporals. I've got an interview from the Keith Murdoch Sound Archive with Corporal Trevor Harper. He's a corporal in the 55th Battalion, so he'll be a part of the 55th, 53rd Battalion when they're merged. He's called up on the 5th of January 1942. He's sent to Greta, where many of the soldiers for the 53rd Battalion were trained, and he's there only 8 weeks after the 53rd Battalion was formed. He is going to detail the very rigorous selection process for corporals, as well as the mission-specific training that the battalion would undergo before it deployed to Port Moresby as well. He's telling the story of his first day at Greta, having just been mobilised into the army.
They lined us up. It was now afternoon. We're going to have a meal. So we get marched off to the mess hut, and we get this marvellous meal. And my most vivid memory of this is it was purple. It was a stew into which they'd put beetroot, and the beetroot made everything purple. That was an eye-opener. That was the beginning. Well, from there it only got worse, I think. Then we got kitted out, the usual business, a bag full of straw to sleep on, and the uniform, etc. that they had. We got most of our uniform and kit. We did not get any weapons. They weren't any weapons to be given to us at this stage. What happened then? Oh, we marched up and down, and we stood to attention, and we stood at ease, and we did parades with a broomstick and learned a little bit of rifle drill until they did give us some weapons. Then we did route marches up and down the dusty roads around Greta, and that was the basis of our training, really. We didn't do much else.
Learning the realities of the relationships between the different parts. I mean, you've already learnt that officers don't talk to privates, but can you remember other ways in which you were taught how to fit in with the army system?
As I remembered, we weren't taught very much, we weren't told very much, we just found things out. I remember walking across the program one evening, just about on sunset, and of course they played retreat. We had no idea what retreat was, we just kept on walking. And all of a sudden this stentorian voice screamed out, "Stand still, that man." So we stand still, you see, and then we found out that when retreat is being blown, you don't move. This is when they lower the flag at sunset, and the night watch is supposed to come on by tradition. But that's how we learned. We learned by making mistakes and then finding out what we'd done wrong.
Your NCOs and lieutenants, I suppose, they're the people that are supposed to be in most direct contact. I mean, what sort of people did you have over you at that time?
Our NCOs, if I give you an example, I went into headquarter company and they said, "Righto, you 30 men, you're a mortarman, and you 30 men, you're pioneers, and you 30 blokes, you're going to be in the tank attack or the anti-tank platoon, and can anybody here drive a truck? Okay, you're transport." Okay, now that was fine for headquarter company. In the rifle companies, I numbered the fellows off again, 33 to this platoon and so on, gave them their kit and said, "Righto, go in and arrange your kit." So they went in and they rolled up their pallahouses and they laid their kit out on the pallahouses they thought it should be and hung their webbing up on the pegs and so on. And then the inspecting officer came through and said, "Oh, you did a good job of that, you're a corporal." And that's how they got to be NCOs.
That happened in your company?
My word, that's what happened. You were picked out obviously on what they thought was a little bit of intelligence perhaps, or a little bit of an approach to doing things which was neat and tidy. So then you became an NCO, you became a lance corporal or a corporal or whatever.
What about the sergeants?
Sergeants, normally speaking, were corporals from previous camps who had gone up and were already corporals. They got promoted.
And, I mean, these were the people who presumably should have been explaining what retreat and all those other things were. How much were they talking to you?
We didn't get much of this. All we got was learn how to stand up straight, how to stand to attention, keep your thumbnails by your sides, head up, chin in, shoulders back, and this sort of thing. We weren't told much about Army, we weren't even explained the difference in ranks. We didn't know whether 2 pips on the shoulder was a lieutenant and 3 was a captain, 1 crown was a major. We didn't know these things. We found out later on. We were saluting warrant officers, and we shouldn't have been because they're non-commissioned officers. We didn't know, and we weren't told.
How long did this go on for?
I'd say this went on. This would have gone on for probably the first 6 weeks or so. Things just were happening. Sheer weight of numbers and the fact that it was written in the rule book somewhere, it just happened. Then you became a little bit more wise and you started to find out and things sort of fell into place.
Corporal Harper goes on to talk about his time at the range, where he is given the grand total of 5 rounds to become completely familiar with his weapon and an accurate shot. We're going to go back to him. He's got an interesting description of the officers that he was working with. Remember, as a corporal, he is 18 years old.
So how much were you having to do with the officers? Were you talking to them very much at this stage?
Not a great deal, because I think our officers were trying to learn as quickly as we were. A lot of these gentlemen had come straight from officers' training school. They learned it all in the book, but they knew nothing about actually handling of men, reactions of men to orders and things like this. Because while I'm speaking here from hindsight, what I know now, not what I knew then, they were learning. Matter of fact, when I was in New Guinea later on, one of the officers in charge of me was 6 months younger than myself, and he'd come straight from a public school, high school, so Joey's or some rather, through the cadet corps as an officer.
And he hadn't done any officer training, particularly in the army?
So he hadn't done any in the army, but he'd done very little.
This gives us some insights so that even if Lieutenant Logan had been given the time and the resources to be able to develop a training program, he would have struggled because of the fact that there were no trained NCOs. There was his platoon sergeant. I'm not sure who that was, but he probably was in a very similar boat to himself. So the platoon is unable to effectively train for combat. Think of what this would have been like for the company commanders. They would have had 3 platoons that were patrolling through the jungle without an experienced lieutenant, without an experienced platoon sergeant, in fact, with very few people with any real skills within the platoons. This kind of scenario would have tested even the most battle-hardened company command team. But we don't have battle-hardened commanders of the companies. Remember, all of the company commanders are temporary captains, when in reality they should have been majors. They should have been experienced majors who had served time as lieutenants, served time as captains, done the necessary courses, had time to reflect on the lessons that they've got, as well as gotten on-the-job training. The 53rd Battalion had none of this. We've got inexperienced company commanders trying to command inexperienced lieutenants who have got inexperienced section commanders. All of these factors would culminate on the 27th of August with the disaster of the death of the CO. As we mentioned in a previous episode, the CO was killed after he went out looking for information with the intelligence officer, who was Lieutenant Logan. There's nothing documented in the war diary, but I think that there's a strong circumstantial case that Lieutenant Colonel Ward has taken Lieutenant Logan away from being a platoon commander and pulled him into battalion headquarters where he'd be able to supervise him and mentor him. It's fairly obvious that Lieutenant Logan would have had no training whatsoever in the roles and responsibilities of the battalion intelligence officer, nor how to perform that role. This is compounded by the fact that brigade headquarters is getting some of the information from battalion patrols before it is becoming to battalion headquarters. Brigadier Porter is struggling to build a clear picture of what the enemy is doing, and he's lacking information about some of the companies from the 53rd Battalion. This is because the reports and returns aren't getting through, because they're not well-disciplined companies. It's the first time that the companies have been in contact. It's the first time that the company commanders have been in that role. It's their first time in contact as well. This is all very confusing for all of them. We know that Brigadier Porter has been issuing increasingly frequent demands for information from the 53rd Battalion. And you can see that Lieutenant Colonel Ward's trying to do the right thing here. He's thinking, I am going to go out and I am going to get the information that I need because it is not coming from my company commanders. He thinks he's patrolling to one of the companies. However, he doesn't know that the Japanese have encircled them. Now, we don't know what information Battalion Headquarters had been receiving. And I think it's really important to remember that Lieutenant Logan is doing his utmost in an incredibly stressful environment, and he has had extremely little training, formal training, nor exercises that would have prepared him for this role. Everyone's in the same boat, and that just makes the situation worse. The pressure from the Japanese as they advance and as they encircle platoons and companies creates a situation that is turbulent and rapidly deteriorating, with which the battalion headquarters cannot cope. This is the heart of manoeuvre warfare. The Japanese are within the OODA loop of Lieutenant Colonel Ward. Remember OODA loop: observe, orientate, decide, act. If the battalion had better training, better education, and more experience, then the OODA loop would have been a lot tighter and it would have been harder for the Japanese to get ahead of the battalion. That, sadly, was not the case. And it was to cost the CO, his intelligence officer, and his protection party their lives. One can only think of the bravery of Lieutenant Logan as he is struggling to build that intelligence picture, surrounded by incredibly hostile terrain, an unforgiving environment, an unrelenting enemy, and everyone around him is just as unprepared as he is. And that is why, despite training being a command responsibility, even if they'd had the time and the resources, the battalion wouldn't have been able to be trained appropriately. There just wasn't the mass of officers and soldiers within the battalion who knew what they were doing. The next principle is unit training is critical. The doctrine states, it is not sufficient to rely on formal courses for the development and maintenance of skills. Commanders must place constant emphasis on tailored training of individuals and teams in order to generate optimal collective effectiveness. The challenge of skill fade and posting turbulence must be managed while mastering, maintaining, and continuously improving the skills necessary to win. Training must be conducted for a purpose to meet a standard. All Army training is derived from directed tasks or priorities and is completed to a specified Army training level and standard. As we've seen, the soldiers were well and truly below the standard required for troops who were about to go into combat, so skill fade is less of a concern. We do know that New Guinea Force was trying to increase the skills of the troops. There's a documentation about a course that was run for the signallers to not only provide them with better skills, it would also increase their pay grade. These opportunities for training, though, were few and far between. This principle also alludes to the fact of unit training, training as an entire battalion. The battalion is going to be able to generate more combat power when each of the companies is working together, including the support company. So remember, they would have had a mortar platoon. The 53rd Battalion left their mortars at Port Moresby and their mortarmen fought as infantry. This may give you a clue why Lieutenant Colonel Ward would deny himself the ability to generate a combined arms effect with his mortars, his organic fire support. Once again, let's have a listen to Corporal Trevor Harper. He's a mortarman, he's a 55th Battalion, and he is going to detail the level of excellence as a mortar platoon they were able to achieve.
I was in the mortar platoon at this time. We did route marches, and then came the crunch. We started being sent off on work parties. Work parties down to the wharf to unload this ship and that ship, the Swart and Hunt and the MacDury and the different ships would come in. A lot of our boys were down there working on those. We sent off on other work parties around the garrison area of Moresby itself, and there was very, very little, if any, training done at all.
There's quite a lot of feeling about these work parties, isn't there, in retrospect?
In retrospect, yes, because that's all we did. We worked. When it looked like the Japanese were going to invade Moresby by sea, they took us up, I think it was Parga Hill above Moresby. We proceeded then to dig mortar pits and so on, and we were told this is where we would be. That was it. Well, we dug these mortar pits in very, very hard conditions with picks which turned round and looked like bent toothpicks by the time we finished, and we just dug holes, but we didn't know when we dug the holes, I don't know whether we would have been able to use the mortars much anyhow, because we weren't trained very much in using mortars. I think my gun crew we'd probably fired 3 shells out of a mortar. There was a thing that said, with a mortar, if you were firing in the rain, you had to be very careful that the barrel didn't get wet because you get a drop shot. And we discussed how we'd overcome this in rain. And in retrospect, it's absolutely stupid to say, well, every third bomb we won't take the safety cap off. That'll dry the barrel. But the barrel would be dry from the bomb before. So, I mean, this is what we knew about mortaring. We did a battalion demonstration for some of the brass, and we were firing blind over a hill. I remember this. So we got rushed up in a Bren gun carrier, and the gun crew leaps out with a base plate and the barrel and the tripod and a couple of bandoliers of bombs. And I think it was 6-3 in each. And we spud the base plate in on the side of the hill and set everything up with the aiming posts and rapid fire 6 bombs. But we didn't realise that the base plate, every time the bomb went off, was going downhill and skewing to one side. So instead of the bombs landing all around about the same area, they were going in a direct line towards the observers, who weren't very impressed. That was the end of that mortar exercise.
Did they give you more training as a result?
Nope. We didn't get any more training apart from because of that, no. We were told what we were done wrong. Actually firing a gun and doing it properly, I don't remember we ever did that.
Right, so how long did this go for?
Well, this went on then until, I think it was around about the September 1942, by which time, of course, the Japanese had landed at Buna and were pushing the 39th Battalion back across the Kokoda Trail. And they sent us up then to the last ditch line of defence, which was Isles Corner, as a last stopgap before the Japanese got to Moresby. So we manned mortar pits there, and the battalion sent out a few patrols. We also sent out work parties carrying ammunition and rations forward from that position to troops further up. And then we stopped. Then, of course, when the Japanese stopped and started to retreat back across the Kokoda Trail, it took us back to Moresby.
2 little snippets there from Corporal Harper. Firstly, if the 53rd Battalion's mortarmen were as poorly trained as the 55th, no wonder they were left behind. Secondly, those mortars were going to be used as the last line of defence for Port Moresby. There's something fundamentally wrong when that is all the training that they are getting. The third principle is that training must be realistic. It states, at appropriate stages in the training cycle, training activities should replicate or simulate operational circumstances and environments as realistically as possible. Training cannot address every potential operational circumstance. Therefore, commanders need to optimise training opportunities by selecting representative and challenging scenarios that are complex, ambiguous, and unpredictable. Simulation can be used to enhance realism in training. Where appropriate, training should involve joint, multinational, and multi-agency participants. I don't want to belabor the point that the militia battalions were poorly trained in Port Moresby. What I do want to do, though, is I want to provide an illustration of what training looks like when it is done correctly. And we'll start by highlighting some training that's been done incorrectly. This was the Italian army that the 6th Division was going to fight at Bardia. This information comes from the Zombie Myths book. The Italian army had very little focus on unit and subunit training, so that's at battalion and company level. Very little importance was placed on field training, and in fact, during winter, there was no training at all. The Italian army was based on conscripts, and their training was designed to produce soldiers of a standard level. However, there was little emphasis on large exercises. This was known, there just wasn't any desire to improve the training of the Italian soldiers. The Italian foreign minister had stated that the fascist army was in a pitiful state. Training hardly improved for Italian troops in North Africa after they entered the war. Training was predominantly in barracks and did little to provide them with the resilience they would need when on the battlefield. There were virtually no field exercises, and as the army started to prepare for the invasion of Egypt, the conscripts that it was receiving had received no military training. The situation for officers was hardly any better. If they needed to move away from the coast road, they needed to request a land navigator who was able to use a map and a compass. There was no practice in the development of combined arms. When soldiers started to be captured, it became apparent just how poorly trained they had been. Officers were captured who'd never been on a combined arms exercise, and soldiers were captured who had never fired their rifles before. The Italian army struggled with training for a number of reasons. Firstly, there were no decent training grounds within Italy. There was a paucity of equipment and ammunition, which made it difficult to schedule training activities. The military bureaucracy made it difficult to promulgate lessons learned. This was compounded by the fact that there was low levels of literacy amongst the soldiers. But the biggest impediment to generating combat power within the Italian army was the culture of the officers themselves. They believed that in combat, intuition and individual valour would be worth more than well-trained troops. Fighting spirit and improvisation were the watchwords for most of the Italian army. The one part that didn't follow this was the artillery. The mathematical and technical nature of the work of the gunners meant that they received the best of the officers and soldiers. Italian gunners were better trained than any other corps within the army. This is why the 6th Division regarded the Italian gunners as the most dangerous and tenacious of their foes. Major Fred Chilton of the 2nd Battalion wrote, "There is no question that the Italian gunners were well-trained and determined troops, prepared to fight it out to the last." The training and level of preparation within the 6th Division would almost be completely opposite to that of the Italians that they would fight for the first time at Bardia. Indeed, Gavin Long wrote in the official history that it was doubtful whether in the succeeding 5 years any Australian force was fitter for battle. Craig Stockings writes, "As soon as the Australian troops disembarked in Palestine and later in Egypt, the regimes for collective training set down within the 6th Division were realistic, comprehensive, rigorous, and intensive. Early training programs in the Middle East followed a traditional sequence of activities, progressing from section to battalion level by May 1940. Particular focus was given to minor tactics and small group procedures. Once the battalions were ready, they moved on to brigade-level exercises, and by August 1940, Tubby Allen and Stan Savage believed that their brigades were ready for action." Late 1940 saw a series of divisional exercises. While all of this was going on, individual training continued, utilising British Army schools, including the Staff College at Haifa. The senior officers course at the Middle East Tactical School was seen as the most intensive and extensive course that Australian regimental officers had been through. 500 of the officers and 2,200 non-commissioned officers had been through formal training courses whilst in the Middle East before they had even seen combat. The 6th Division had a lot of officers and senior NCOs who had served on the Western Front in the First World War, and they made sure that the lessons from the last year were inculcated within the division. Stockings writes about the transformation from a keen amateur force into a professional military over the time during which the training was conducted. Troops began to complain that life was an endless series of route marches, PT, exercises, and mock battles instead of real ones. Many began to lament eternal exercises on the Hebron Hills, with combat drills practiced until they became automatic. Many a mock battle was fought between the armies of Northland and Southland under the eager eyes of umpires looking for lessons to learn and improvements to be made. As the 6th Division moved to surround Bardia, a patrolling program was begun. This had the benefit of ensuring that junior commanders understood what it was like to be under fire before their first main attack. Mackay is seeing that the value of the experiences that they are getting is transitioning from mock battles into real contact with the enemy, but in the least threatening way possible. Stockings details the preparation for the battle. On the eve of their first action, 6th Division actually built a scale replica of the break-in point so that engineers could practice pulling down the anti-tank ditch and building tank crossings. As a particular example of the extent to which Australian officers were determined to prepare their men for action, on learning of his unit's role, Lieutenant Colonel Ken Ether directed his men to practice night movement like that which would be required for their approach march to the battle. On the 31st of December, Ether had his whole unit rehearsing movements over short distances at a slow rate of 100 metres every 2 minutes, just as they would have to move in the coming assault. Another exercise on the night of the 1st of January practiced precise paces, bearings, distances and directions. By day, Ether's battalion formed into a mock assembly area and rehearsed moving the same distance to a fictitious start line before advancing in the same direction for the same distance at the same time of day as the real assault. They then breached fake wire obstacles and lead companies charged the gap. Ether would write, "This being our first engagement and the initiation of the 2nd AIF into battle, we would not risk a setback." Frank Berryman wrote, "We were anxious to avoid the confusion of Anzac, of Fromelles and Pozières, or a 1st Bullecourt, so our preparation was as thorough as we could make it." The first battles of the 6th Division against the Italians were incredibly successful, and this was a success that was built on the difference in tactical proficiency, small unit tactical proficiency, and the ability to generate combined arms. The disparity between combat power was directly related to the differences in training programs. 6th Division had the time, resources and expertise to deliver the training and education that set the foundation for the experience that soldiers and officers would build upon to overcome the Italian defenders. Compare and contrast with the militia battalions in Port Moresby. Soldiers were not proficient in their basic soldier skills, and they weren't given the opportunity to train in a realistic environment. It's a travesty that they were entering the jungle for the first time, the terrain in which they would be fighting when they commenced their movement up the Kokoda track. The fourth principle is encourage initiative. Initiative and judgment must be encouraged during training activities in order to develop leadership and personal skills. The outcomes generated by individuals exercising initiative, including mistakes, must be used as positive learning opportunities. The last principle is evaluate and continuously improve. Training must be evaluated to confirm the effectiveness and efficiency of the training and to identify potential lessons. The lessons process is central to the continuous improvement of training. I feel these last two principles really build on the first three principles. It's difficult to encourage initiative when you've got soldiers who can't even use their rifle. And to evaluate and continuously improve training, you need to be running training. The war diaries talk about one battalion exercise, which was a shambles. There's nothing wrong with that if you've got the time to be able to understand what the mistakes are and then start developing training to fix that and then conduct more battalion exercises. But there wasn't the expertise, time, resources, or anything else that would enable them to learn what the mistakes were and start remediating them. So that's it. We've looked at the 5 principles of training, and I think realistically it brings it very sharply into focus why the 53rd Battalion was set up for failure when you look at all of the issues that there were within the training program. Next episode, we're going to start looking at the 39th Battalion. That is a battalion with a much more storied history on the Kokoda track than the 53rd Battalion. There are some interesting similarities and stark differences, and I think it's important to look at those because that's going to give us some idea of just how important some of those differences are.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.